Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on January 12th, 2024 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Before we get into this week's Astro News you can use, my usual quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. And to remind you that a new show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern on most major podcast platforms. However, if you listen at karmicevolution.com, you'll see a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our individual sun sign, actually needs to be happy. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some astrological words of wisdom. In addition, if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose, and what may be holding you back from achieving your highest destiny in this lifetime, I offer a 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, a discounted rate for podcast listeners only. So if you feel stuck, frustrated, or otherwise stymied in your relationships, your career, or other areas such as your health, and want to learn why, this reading is for you. If you'd like to understand how, by letting your unconscious script based on old soul-conditioned behaviors from the past run the show, and now want to become more conscious about how to change this script going forward, then this reading is for you. And if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, then this reading is definitely for you. Conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of my special discounted offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And finally, I'd like to announce that I'm presenting a lecture for the Astrological Society of Princeton on Sunday, January 14th, in just a couple of days, titled The Fight for Women's Equality in America, the History of the U.S. Sibley Chart's Chiron Return, Women's Rights, and the 2024 U.S. presidential election. This lecture will cover the fact that, at its founding, America's laws did not include women in their concept of equality. From Abigail Adams' 1776 plea to her husband John Adams, "Don't forget the ladies," to the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision on June 24, 2022, learn how the historical triggering of the U.S. natal chart's Chiron configuration illustrates this nation's long history of the fight for women's rights. This talk will first delineate the deeper meaning of these natal Chiron aspects in the U.S. chart and how the wounded healer factors into this nation's history of its wounds related to equality in partnership. We'll then explore the incremental historical gains and setbacks for women's rights made during each of the first 4 U.S. Chiron returns, which occur approximately every 50 to 51 years, culminating last with the historic Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973, and how now the fight for women's equality has become an issue yet again since transiting Chiron once again activated the U.S. Chiron configuration for the fifth time in history when it squared the U.S. Cancer Sun on April 18, 2022. Those of you who are astute will recognize that this occurred approximately 2 months before that U.S. Supreme Court's infamous June 24, 2022 Dobbs decision, which disregarded legal precedent and restricted the right of women to make decisions about their own bodies. So this current triggering of the natal U.S. Chiron aspects into manifestation won't actually complete until February 18th of 2025, but will be heavily in play during the November 5th, 2024 U.S. presidential election. That's because transiting Chiron retrograde will be waxing only minutes away from its second exact return on November 7th of 2024. So this lecture will explore through an astrological lens the November 5th, 2024 U.S. presidential election chart and whether American women will rally and use their hard-earned right to vote to set into motion the restoration of their individual right to bodily autonomy and equality for the future as Chiron makes its final exact return February 18, 2025. Again, this lecture will be live, but there will be a recording after the fact, and it will occur on Sunday, January 14th at 2 p.m., and the cost is $20 for non-members and $5 for Astrological Society of Princeton members. To find out more and to sign up, simply go to aspnj.org. Okay, so now let's get to this week's Astro News you can use. I want to preface this podcast by noting that there's so much news coming at us all, both domestically and globally, that I've decided to focus on only a minute portion of it in detail for the sake of brevity and clarity to make the point of how such news relates to astrological energies. What I leave out in detail is by no means unimportant. But the overview, the astrological overview, is that we've got the movement forward of Jupiter in Taurus and Mercury in Sagittarius since December 30th and January 1st, respectively, and with it, we've seen since much news out of the legal realm, as well as about things like immigration, which Jupiter Sagittarius rules, one of the subjects currently holding up U.S. congressional agreement on a budget resolution to fund the government for 2024. Now, all planets are in direct motion, as I noted last week, except for Uranus and Taurus, which will station direct again at 19 degrees and 5 minutes of Taurus late on January 26th and early on the 27th, depending on your time zone. So it's full speed ahead, as I noted previously, which may bode well for those not hell-bent on delay. You know who I'm talking about here, right? Meanwhile, we're headed toward Pluto's entrance into Aquarius on January 20th, which occurs just after the Sun conjoins Pluto at 29 Capricorn, and then the Sun enters Aquarius for the next month that day. So this will be reminiscent of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which occurred back on December 21st of 2020 at 0 degrees and 30 minutes of Aquarius, and kicked off a nearly 20-year cycle until they meet again. Likewise, so the point here is it's a sensitive degree. Everything entering 0 Aquarius is going to trigger some of the themes around the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction from 4 years ago, and I will be talking about that in the future, not just now. I just want to point out that it's part of the overview. And likewise, we underwent the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 12th of 2020 at 22 degrees and 45 minutes of Capricorn, and that's a cycle that will last approximately 36 years and result in a new world order. And that's because this conjunction cycle did so in Leo in 1947 post-World War II, which led to the development of things like NATO, or the solidification in the Western world of, a new world order, essentially. And also is regard this Saturn-Pluto cycle, it's called the synodic cycle, when the cycle starts anew, when the faster-moving planet, which in this case is Saturn, meets up with the slower-moving planet, which in this case is Pluto. It happened again in late 1982 and early 1983, when they conjoined again in Libra, when they conjoined, again in Libra, sorry for the glitch, leading to a period of global government austerity and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the ultimate dissolution of the USSR and the lessening of the Cold War. But what's kind of important about that, too, is how we saw at that point soaring inflation and bank failures. So I'm just pointing that out for future reference. So I'm going to speak more about these influences in the future, especially, of course, the big topic for everyone, all astrologers right now, is Pluto's entrance into Aquarius, where he'll be for about 7 months before he retrogrades briefly for about 2 months before he goes into Aquarius in November for the next 20 years. But for now, I've chosen to focus mostly on the domestic situation in the U.S., rather than looking at the world at large. However, I would feel remiss if I didn't mention at least some of the major points of what is going on now without actually, pinning them, which I've done in the past, to, from the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, which also, again, I didn't say this, I'm going to say it later, but, there's so much inherent in the Saturn in Pisces transit right now, people being restricted, the movement and the flow of people being curtailed and barriered and boundaried, etc. So we'll get back into that in future podcasts. But also the recent violence over drug cartel crackdowns in Ecuador that some of you may have seen in the news, that led to violent jailbreaks, including when an armed group burst into a television studio during a live broadcast and held journalists at gunpoint. One of the perpetrators said something about not, fighting the mafia, like he was complaining as though he was victimized as a member of the mafia, that the legal eagles were coming after them, something of that point. I know that sounds a little hazy, so we'll get back to that at other points. We also had the resignation, finally, of Wayne LaPierre, the former head of the National Rifle Association, and how this may or may not symbolize a new era in terms of guns, okay? So, again, we'll get more into that in the future. But also, these Trump legal developments and the declaration of his lawyer before, this was on Wednesday, before the 3 Washington, D.C. appellate court judges who stated that a president can commit murder with impunity due to his or her carte blanche presidential immunity when they're in office, all the way from there to yesterday's closing arguments in Trump's New York civil trial, where damages will eventually be announced by the judge, potentially to the tune of $370 million, which would likely end the legal cessation of the Trump organization's ability to continue doing business anywhere in New York State, not to mention the beginning of his E. Jean Carroll's rematch defamation trial beginning next week. So again, Jupiter's moving forward, Mercury is moving forward, and I'll touch on how Mercury is going into Capricorn tomorrow too. So tomorrow, or is it the 14th? Hold on. I think it's it is the 13th, yeah, tomorrow. And that's not mentioning the Hunter Biden stuff, whereby he surprised the congressional committee getting ready to try to impeach his father, Joe Biden, by ordering him, meaning the son, Hunter, to testify behind closed doors rather than in public. And so much more news, including what I believe to be, again, the Saturn and Pisces related Houthi rebel attacks in the Red Sea as part of their objection to the Israeli bombing of and barricading of the Gazans, but they're attacking international cargo ships, which it's already disrupted the routes that they take. Some of these ships are having to take much longer routes, which of course increases their transportation costs, which of course will increase the ultimate price of whatever cargo is on that ship when it lands in a retail store or a factory or a car lot or whatever. So, and that Saturn in Pisces, just like I mentioned in terms of Gaza, is also prevalent in all of this talk here in the U.S., and other nations as well, if you're a reader of international news, about how immigration restrictions are necessary, according to the GOP in the U.S. Congress, for a passage of a U.S. budget bill for 2024. So again, the point here is that Saturn tries to restrict the natural flow of the universe by creating boundaries that represent how the ego defends itself from the eruption of the unconscious into consciousness, which is really, on some level, the thing that frightens Saturn the most. But again, I digress. I just wanted to cover, as I said, some of these things, but rather than just giving you a smattering of everything, I chose to focus more on what I love doing most, which is delineating individuals' astrological charts. And what's most on my mind this week is the U.S. Congress and the current Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson's chart, and his chances of longevity there, as well as the chances of Donald Trump beating all of his legal cases based on his chart. So I'll start with last week, which was when I spoke about yesterday's Capricorn new moon, which occurred on January 11th at 20 degrees and 44 minutes of Capricorn at 3:57 a.m. Pacific time and 6:57 a.m. Eastern time, and how I noted it was going to be nearly exact square to the transiting karmic mean and true nodes, which at the time of the lunation were at 20 degrees and 19 minutes and 20 degrees and 12 minutes, Libra and Aries, respectively. So no matter which nodes one chooses to use, because sometimes they're that close together and sometimes they're just a little bit further apart, just depending on the day. The nodes are generally retrograde, but for very short periods, several times, they will station direct. And that is why you see the discrepancy in part between the mean and the true. When the mean is obviously exactly what it says. It's the mean calculation mathematically of the degree based on, on where it is in the middle. So no matter which nodes one chooses to use, we know that this Capricorn new moon, whose auspices we're still under today as the monthly lunar cycle begins to wax now, formed a cardinal square to the Venus-ruled Libra South Node. Now, this Libra South Node has been asking us in general since the nodes regressed into Libra South Node and Aries North Node on July 18th, 2023, to release our tendency toward what Stephen Forrest calls polite dishonesty when it comes to expressing our individual opinions and any tendency to ally with others in partnership by going along to get along rather than taking an independent or leadership stance. Now, I would say or interject here that with the coming movement, not only of the sun in the short term, but of course Pluto into Aquarius soon, I've begun to feel like Libra is partnership, Aquarius is with friends and groups. So I feel like, given the circumstances, which I'll talk about more in a minute, we're really being asked to break away not from past partnerships that actually might align us with groupthink, and that's the Aquarian part, right? Oh, I have to go along with what my tribe thinks, whereas Libra is more about commitment to relationships. Oh, I'm committed to my partnerships, and even if I don't agree with what they think, I have to go along to get along, which I'll talk about in a minute. But also that this sort of bleeds over with the current energies coming into play with that groupthink, where it's like, oh, no, I'm part of this group, they accept me, and I don't want to piss anyone off or get thrown out of the group, shunned or isolated because I have an independent viewpoint or opinion. So the Capricorn new moon had both luminaries square to the south node, as I just said, but also to the Aries north node, which again in general calls us to lead rather than follow, or to forge new paths without fear or intimidation, and to fight for individual freedoms. So when we throw that Aquarius energy coming into play, again into that mix, it's, fighting, it's sort of like forming new groups to fight against the old groups, right? Because we know that Uranus-ruled Aquarius is an archetypal signature of revolution, particularly when, we're talking about this Capricorn new moon. Anyway, but the square aspect of the Saturn-ruled Capricorn sun to the Mars-ruled Aries North Node tells us that accomplishing our goals of integrating partnership with the freedom of independence won't come without a great deal of tension and frustration. So when we boil it all down, this lunation illustrates that the way to integrate these Mars and Venus ruled nodal opposites is, as I said last week, with the help of a strong, grounded, realistic, read earthy and practical hand represented by Saturn-ruled, foundationally oriented Capricorn archetype. So this Capricorn new moon asks each of us personally to move toward releasing our inclination or habit to always negotiate and compromise through alignment with only old, outworn partnerships. But in order to accomplish this goal, that of disabusing ourselves of the notion that these partnerships are still the best thing for us, we must understand that it will take a great deal of effort and that we will likely be frustrated as we attempt to try any kind of separation. However, this gets even more complicated. Some of us might realize we cannot remain stuck in the Libran past of that quote-unquote polite dishonesty of which Forrest speaks, meaning going along to get along by not rocking the boat, without understanding our responsibility to others. That responsibility is inherent in the Capricorn Libra cardinal square of the luminaries to the Venus-ruled South Node, which archetypally pits duty and obligation against pleasure. So we're fighting now also any tendency to feel duty-bound to our partners versus being free to express ourselves if our opinions or emotions differ from theirs, as I said. So this energy is compounded further because both Capricorn luminaries, the sun and the moon, also squared wounded healer Chiron and Aries at this lunation, which will conjoin with the transiting true north node at 16 degrees and 45 minutes of Aries circa February 20th of 2024, and with the mean node at 17 degrees. You see here they're approximately a little less than a degree apart. So from 1645 true node in Aries to the mean node at 1727 Aries between February 20th and March 5th, which again asks us to deal with the frustrations inherent in speaking out about our wounds, particularly those incurred through our past partnerships. That's the Chiron influence. So we might watch now how, between now and early March, a steady hand might bring resolution to negotiations that reduce the tension, or should I say friction, between those partnered on one side of the equation, or should I say argument, with those proposing being independent enough to reach across the aisle, to use a congressional metaphor. So that brings me to the current effort in the U.S. Congress to stave off a government shutdown once again, And the current dispute about whether or not to pass a continuing resolution, known as a CR, as was done last minute on November 17th of 2023, which happened to be the day the Sun conjoined Mars in Scorpio, the archetypal symbol of joint resources and other people's money, as in taxes, which help fund the government, at least in part. So before this, on September 29th, which was the day of the Aries new moon, when Venus in Leo squared Uranus in Taurus, according to Wikipedia, quote, the House Committee on Rules convened to consider a continuing resolution to fund the federal government for an additional month. The bill failed, with additional far-right Republicans defying Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House at that time. McCarthy stated that he would support a continuing resolution without aid for Ukraine. The following day, hours before a shutdown was expected to occur, the House voted to pass a continuing resolution to fund the government through November 17. Nearly the entire Democratic caucus supported the resolution, and it was approved in the Senate. So as you can well remember, or even if you don't, we had the Aries new moon, which is about taking action, and Venus square Uranus, which is sudden events. So Kevin McCarthy's agreement to put this on the floor of the House for a vote that required Democrats to pass so angered his right-wing GOP House minority in the form of the Freedom Caucus that they ousted him as Speaker, as we all well know. Since then, as he was experiencing his second Saturn return, and all of this occurred during that period, he announced he would be taking all his toys and going home by leaving the House at the end of 2023, which he has done. So between McCarthy's ouster and October 25th, just days before the October 28th lunar eclipse at 5 degrees 9 minutes of Taurus, when Mercury conjoined Mars in Scorpio, Louisiana Representative Mike Johnson was elected to become the new GOP House leader, replacing McCarthy, who by November 15th managed to forge agreement with the Senate, this is Johnson, and the passage of the continuing resolution that extended funding for military, transportation, and housing and urban development departments until January 19th, 2024, with other funding for the rest expiring on February 2nd. As an interesting side note, there was an exact Mercury-Mars conjunction in Scorpio on October 29th. And for those of you who may remember, when Johnson was elected, I mentioned in this podcast that the moon was in Pisces, and Mercury and Mars also went on to square, was it Neptune? No, something went on to square Neptune. I thought it was that, but it couldn't have been if they were in Scorpio. Anyway, there was definitely a lot of confusion, right? Because what happened was, after a lot of repeated failures to find a Speaker for the House, most of you who listen to this are certainly well aware of this, the House elected a member about which they knew nothing. And so they voted in the dark, which is a Neptunian thing: confusion, illusion, and delusion. So here we are again, right? Mercury, having been in Sag, gone into Capricorn, retrograded back into Sag, and now direct. Here we are again, approaching a deadline with no compromise in sight. Except that Speaker Johnson has now found himself in exactly the same position that Kevin McCarthy was in before him, with the Freedom Caucus GOP contingent in the House unable to stomach a bipartisan agreement. So we're beginning to see the Capricorn new moon energy emerge here, in my opinion, as we try to figure out whether Johnson will be able to stay or will be forced out a la McCarthy, who needed only one House member to call for his removal from speakership, and then that would lead to the vote, and that rule that you only need one House member to call for a new vote is still in effect. So Johnson, born January 30th of 1972 in Shreveport, Louisiana, with no known birth time, nevertheless has a Leo South Node and a Leo moon, though we can't be sure of his moon's actual degree without a definite birth time. Excuse me. And he also has an Aquarius sun, which conjoins his Aquarian North Node, an Aries Mars trine to his Jupiter in Sagittarius, and an out-of-sign opposition from Saturn in Taurus to Neptune in Sag. I've often found Neptune in Sagittarius to be a warrior for a cause, which is further validated to be a religious one in this particular case in Mike Johnson's chart, based on his actual life as an avowed Southern Baptist, and by his Mars-Jupiter easy trine aspect. So a Leo South Node, in terms of the evolutionary interpretation, means he's got a past life karma of being a chosen one, or someone who hails from royalty, meaning, in practical terms, he might be a bit too focused on himself as aligned with some kind of greatness. This would explain why, on December 5th, at a gathering of Christian nationalist lawmakers called the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, surprisingly, Johnson revealed, and here I quote, this is from Rolling Stone magazine, "The Lord began to wake me up through this 3-week process in the middle of the night to speak to me," Johnson insisted. Now, at the time, he continued, "I assumed the Lord is going to choose a new Moses, but because of his own lesser rank among the GOP's leadership," Johnson said, he believed the heavenly message to be, "You're going to allow me to be Aaron to Moses," citing the role of the Old Testament prophet's brother and biblical sidekick. But after so many unsuccessful votes to elect a new House Speaker, God reportedly told him that was not the message, Johnson insisted, recalling that the Lord said to him, "No, it's you who must step forward." So, thus we see revealed Johnson's Moses complex, at least in my opinion. Further, his moon, though again we cannot know its exact degree, it sits in Leo, so it might be conjoined to his natal Leo South Node, and or is at noon it's conjoined to his natal Leo Ceres as well. So he may have come in from a karmic past of being the one who believes, Jupiter, Saturn, that he's God's gift, who'll bring his followers to the nurturing land of milk and honey. That's related to Ceres, which is the grower of the crops and the sustainer of life through food, through his beliefs and his actions. In addition, as mentioned, his natal Saturn sits at 29 degrees Taurus, known as the Pleiades point, which is often correlated with problems with the eyes, including injury or blindness. And this has to do with the weeping sisters in Greek mythology, who the Pleiades represent, because when Orion began to pursue them, Zeus transformed them first into doves and then into stars to comfort their father Atlas, who was busy being forced to carry the weight of the heavens on his shoulders. And one of the most memorable myths involving the Pleiades is the story of how these 7 sisters literally became stars. According to some versions of the tale, all 7 sisters died by suicide because they were so saddened either by the fate of their father, Atlas, or by the loss of their siblings, known as the Hyades. In turn, Zeus, the ruler of the Greek gods, immortalized the sisters by placing them in the sky. And these are now the 7 stars that form the star cluster in the constellation of Taurus, known as the Pleiades. So as a psychological astrologer, I note that this point opposite Johnson's Neptune at an early Sagittarius degree might well be interpreted as his metaphorical blindness caused by his religious fervor. I'm sure he's completely unconscious of all of that, especially since he's got that Taurus Saturn, which is tethered to the material physical world, in opposition to his Sagittarius Neptune, which can be, at least in his case, all about religious fantasy. I just delineated a bit about Saturn in relationship to its transit through Pisces, which is ruled by the planet Neptune, okay, at least in modern astrology, in which I believe. And so there's a correlation here about his relying on his egos, and the ego is based on what we were taught, told, or forced to believe, either in past life karma or early in this lifetime, and often both, that is resistant to what is part of the soul's wisdom that can emerge from the unconscious through the through the Neptunian or Piscean archetype. And so the Saturnian nature is resistant, and particularly so in Johnson's case because it's in Taurus, which is a fixed sign, to whatever may, he's resistant to relying on what his soul actually knows, based on his boundaried resistance to remaining only in the physical world and not in the world of the spiritual. So he thinks he's being spiritual, in other words, based on his Saturn in Taurus. But in fact, because of its opposition to Neptune, is deluded into thinking that. So in a sense, he's the perfect person to be spotlighted now, not only on the U.S., but the world stage, to illustrate how our nation's whole religious zealotry is currently at odds with our ability to manifest values based on concrete reality. Same is true, again, with the immigration situation. Nobody wants to deal with it, and they haven't dealt with it in Congress for like 25, 30 years. And, look what happens. The tide keeps rising, because that's what happens with Neptune and Pisces. The tide will rise until Saturn goes, oh, wait a minute, I think we got a little problem here. Oh, no, I'm drowning. And that's the manifestation of his worst nightmare. So if and when Johnson goes down, it may well symbolize that he and his ilk are more in the minority than the majority in this country. Personally, at least that's my hope. But right now, Johnson has transiting Jupiter, which is at 5 degrees and 48 minutes of Taurus, not that far from its December 30th station direct at 5:34, squaring his natal nodes at 5 degrees and 3 minutes of Leo, the south node, and Aquarius north node. So transiting Jupiter's also headed to exact square his sun, which is at 9 degrees and 57 minutes of Aquarius, and that will occur circa March 4th. And the day before that transiting Aries North Node Chiron conjunction I just mentioned. Now, in general, that conjunction, because it points us towards our higher destiny, may well bring us all some form of collective healing. Who knows? I think the question is just how long, if the conjunction, like the conjunction of Uranus to the North Node a while back, brings us to the future, how long will that take? And what forces must be overcome in the interim to get there. But, perhaps that will be through the downfall of all those righteous religious warriors out there who've wounded us, including Johnson. Who knows? Now, also at yesterday's Capricorn new moon, transiting Mars quincunx Johnson's natal Leo south node, while it also began quincunxing his natal 4 degree 53 minute Sagittarius Neptune, but he also has his natal Neptune in a trine and a sextile to his natal nodes. In addition, I'd add that transiting Pluto has been rocking and rolling over his 28 degree 1 minute Capricorn Mercury for a while now, which natally trines his 1 degree 51 minute Libra Pluto. And that means when Pluto enters Aquarius, it's going to trine his Pluto. But his natal Mercury is also currently being trined by his progressed Mars in Taurus. Now, I wish we knew the houses and their rulers, because it would give us a lot more detailed information, but unfortunately we don't. But we can assume, based on what we already do know, that he's being asked to make some adjustments via those quincunxes to his belief system, which again is based on both his karmic past, read that of being a Leo South Node or part of royalty or a chosen one, like Moses, and his religious beliefs. reads Saturn opposite Neptune, as he's one of the most devoutly religious Christians in Congress. Next, we see that the January 25th upcoming 5-degree, 14-minute Leo full moon will fall smack on his natal nodes as he approaches his January 30th birthday. Happy birthday, Mr. Speaker! What will be your birthday present, I wonder? He also has that Mars-Jupiter natal trine, which I have been found to be a rather lucky aspect in one's chart, especially when dealing with authority figures or with the law. And since we know he's already part of the legal system as a legislator, he achieved that position, right? Perhaps in part by that natal easy energy. So I've noticed that his fiery Mars-Jupiter trine, especially because Mars in his case is in warlike Aries, and Jupiter's in religious-oriented Sagittarius, as previously noted, that's what causes him to be easily blown in the direction of a warrior with a religious cause. But again, I also believe it's quite a lucky aspect, often when up against, like I said, authority figures or those related to the law or the legal system of which he's currently a part and through which he's been lucky enough to rise to the top. It's also possible his Leo moon, depending on its actual degree, is in a grand fire trine with his Mars-Jupiter trine, meaning he might be more of a leap before you look kind of guy, but which might be exemplified more by his righteous religious beliefs rather than his actual actions, if not both. I don't know. So in other words, he might not leap before he looks so much in terms of making decisions. He is a Saturn in Taurus after all, but he may be that way in terms of his religious beliefs. He's drunk the Kool-Aid, he's lit the fire, whatever, however you want to look at it. So to me, the ultimate question becomes, is someone with an Aquarius North node supposed to be the top dog? Or rather, is he supposed to be a cog in the wheel of humanity, one who works toward equality for all? I'm kind of smothering a smirk and then suppressing any outright laughter at the concept that this guy has equality for all anywhere on his radar screen, and instead, in fact, is obsessed with quite the opposite. Something transiting Pluto's conjunction with his natal Mercury is exemplifying for us all right now. Pluto on Mercury can mean obsession, right? Obsessive thinking, which brings us right back full circle to his Moses complex. So with transiting Jupiter now squaring his nodes, it's his natal Leo South Node, Leo Moon, and easy Jupiter aspects, along with his dissociate Saturn-Neptune opposition, which may prove his ultimate downfall based on his having reached such heights by being so hubristically arrogant in his beliefs in the first place. This month's lunar cycle, beginning with yesterday's January 11th Capricorn new moon and the January 25th Leo full moon, both squaring and conjoining his nodes respectively, as both lunations have transiting Jupiter square to his nodes, will hopefully highlight his hypocrisy, as I believe those in the most far-right corner of the House GOP will have to decide if they'll tolerate or not, especially since he's basically just approved, as I said before, the same budget deal that got McCarthy ousted in the first place. So as Johnson is under increasing pressure from some ultra-conservatives in the House to reject any spending agreement unless President Biden and congressional Democrats agree to stiff new controls to restrict the flow of migrants across the border, Senate Republicans and Democrats have reported progress toward a deal to impose new immigration restrictions, but they cannot probably get there before January 19th. So again, will the GOP House keep Johnson in his speaker position when he repeats the same actions as he is doing now that brought Kevin McCarthy down? I know I'm being a bit repetitive, but, that's just the way I see it. So I want to switch gears a little bit now to talk about how yesterday's Capricorn new moon fell in Donald Trump's 5th house, opposite his natal 11th house Saturn and Venus conjunction in Cancer, and quincunx to his 10th house Gemini North Node and his Gemini Sun. Interestingly, too, his 2nd house progressed Mars is at 13 degrees and 47 minutes of Libra, within a degree of conjoining his natal Juno. Now, Juno, which I've mentioned before, is the goddess asteroid of partnership. In Roman mythology, she's the wife of Jupiter. In Greek mythology, she's Hera, the wife of Zeus. And his natal Juno is at 14 degrees and 48 minutes of Libra, conjunct his natal wounded healer Chiron at 14 degrees 54 minutes of Libra. And both of those form a very tight conjunction, but they're part of a stellium, which is a group of planets either in the same house or the same sign, or both, in this case, in his 2nd house with his natal Jupiter, which falls at 17 degrees and 27 minutes of Libra. Oh, wait, yesterday's Capricorn new moon squared most closely his Libra Jupiter, which opposes his natal Hygeia, the goddess asteroid of health, in his 8th house at 21 degrees and 13 minutes of Aries. Now, there's no disputing that more people are beginning, especially those in the mainstream press, are beginning to give voice to some of his seemingly deranged comments and inability to, let's say, as Ram Dass would say, be here now, without going completely off topic. There was that speech he gave recently where he went off on some tangent about magnets, and everybody was like, what the hell is he talking about? But anyway, I wanted to go back for a minute and say that today, Juno, which is, like I said, the goddess asteroid, is actually stationing retrograde. So as we look at that as part of something that's been touched in his natal chart by this Capricorn new moon, we can see that everyone will be reviewing the terms of their partnerships while Juno is retrograde for the next 10 or 11 weeks. Now, in addition, the transiting sun, hang on a second. So I'm sorry, I misspoke. The transiting sun in Capricorn is waxing toward quincunxing his natal 26-degree Mars and his 29-degree 50-minute Leo ascendant. And during that, now again, this is, quincunx is an adjustment, right? So the sun in general is just, your persona. But the Mars being so close to his ascendant, his persona as a belligerent fighter is needing to be adjusted. So his who he is, or who he is seen as, is being adjusted, right? Again, his belligerent fighting thing. I read some piece in the Times that interviewed like 8 or 10 people in Iowa, I think, because of the upcoming caucus and, primaries there, since it's the first one, and how half of the people who were all obviously Republicans or leaned Republican and had voted for Trump last time or both last times or whatever, that half of them just felt like he was just going on and on and on too much about his grievances, so between him saying that the 2020 election was stolen and all that, they're like, why aren't you just talking about what you're going to do for us in the future? Like, we like what you did in the past. Why don't you talk now about the future, as opposed to just harping on the same thing and, clearly becoming, as I said, belligerent about it. But at the same time, as I pointed out for the past couple of months, transiting Pluto has been quincunxing his ascendant for months. And that, to me, is the biggest signal that, people's assessment of who he actually is going to change. I also mentioned how Uranus has been approaching his midheaven, and that, when it gets to his midheaven, which is at 24 Taurus, it's 2418. It's going to be a little while, but I think it exact conjoins, or it comes within a degree of conjoining in September, which is clearly before the election, but it's going to start to wax into squaring Mars. Now, if we're talking about things like the possibility of a trial and or a conviction, we may well be looking at some sudden kind of, I don't know, change in values, which is what Uranus and Taurus is all about how people feel about how he presents himself as the leader, as, someone who has complete immunity, which brings us to, a couple of things. I mean, one was that, in typical fashion, he just recently said, and I think this has to do with his, Gemini Sun, Uranus opposite his Sagittarius Moon, he threatened that, quote, there will be bedlam if criminal charges damage my candidacy. Now, bedlam is a word that I think many of us who lived through his administration would use to describe him. And so, he uses it, or he uses the fear that there will be bedlam as an attempt to intimidate those who speak out against him or who speak freely. And, also that may incite, the fear that incites in the collective is that it takes only one person to act on this kind of statement that he makes through implementing a violent act. But, this week, too, he made the argument, or his lawyer, John Sauer, made the argument in front of the panel of 3 judges in the D.C. Appellate Court that he, and this was on January 9th, which is the same day that the Capricorn Sun trined Uranus and Taurus, and that Mars and Capricorn sextiled Saturn in Pisces, when he made the, quote, jaw-dropping claim that former presidents are absolutely immune from prosecution, even for murders they ordered while in office. And this is from the New York Times. Mr. Sauer's statement also called to mind the more direct echo from the 2019 Federal Appeals Court argument over whether Mr. Trump could block state prosecutors from obtaining his tax and business records. He maintained that he was immune not only from prosecution, but also from criminal investigation, so long as he was president. Now, of course, this coincides, I mean, you've probably seen on the news already that during the impeachment trial, the lawyer who argued in his favor for the Senate, for against impeachment and against conviction, as did Mitch McConnell, the head of the minority speaker in the Senate, who got up on the Senate floor during that impeachment trial and said that because any crimes that Trump may have committed while in office, while he didn't feel they were worth conviction in the Senate if he was impeached, which he was, he did not vote for conviction because he believed that lay in the realm of the judicial sphere. So in other words, testimony to the fact that lawyers and others argued against conviction in the Senate during his impeachment trial because the judiciary could try and convict him separately for any violations of the law committed, directly defied his arguments by this John Sauer lawyer Wednesday, that he could actually, or Tuesday or Wednesday, that he could actually never be held responsible for any action he took while in the office of president. And that, that he just shot down his own argument, which of course is, ridiculous. Now, there's also, so much more here, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it. I just would say that, we've got some other stuff coming up, but I think that Leo full moon, we'll have the second quarter moon in Aries on January 17th of next week, squaring the sun in Capricorn, which again is the same kind of energy that I was talking about with the Capricorn sun and moon at the Capricorn new moon lunation when they squared the Aries North node, right? It was Capricorn to Aries, and now Aries to Capricorn. This is extremely frustrating. So whatever goes down, because that first quarter waxing square of this month's lunar cycle is going to be on January 17th, 2 days before the deadline to save those 4 divisions of the government from being defunded for 2024 until they pass some kind of continuing resolution or something more binding. So we are still looking, at the fact that when Venus in Sagittarius quincunxes Uranus, which will still be retrograde in Taurus on January 14th, we might expect an unexpected change, again, an adjustment that proves to be some kind of adjustment within relationships. It's possible this may play out on the U.S. national stage in terms of the currently ongoing congressional budget discussions, as many in both the House and Senate are advocating for that continuing resolution that avoids this January 19th and then later February 2nd shutdown. So we shall see. We shall see. We never know, right, until it happens. But anyway, again, there's more, and I will take a look again at some of the more wide-ranging global events because they are so important. The Israeli war, also this funding of Ukraine, which is starting to show on their battlefield, or lack of funding. The Europeans have stepped up meanwhile, but there is only a limited number of things that they will be receiving in order to help defend themselves against Russian bombardment and eventually invasion, etc., which is very much on the world's mind. But for now, thank you everyone for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me January 19th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hold. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.